Hi everyone, you're here today with myself, Rifdi, and Fitri, and we're having this recorded video of our artist talk instead of having one in person, because as you know, we're faced with the current situation. So our show, A Self I Once Knew, is currently showing at DEC, and it's ongoing till the 7th of August. In A Self I Once Knew, the both of us approach the subject of self in differing ways. But at the core of both works is a desire to seek familiarity within ourselves, a sense of self that we have either lost or are afraid to lose.
A Self I Once Knew wouldn't have materialized if it's not for the late Mr. Kwek Ling Ju. So with the Kwek Ling Ju Prize of Excellence in Photography, 2 ADM students are given the opportunity to once again indulge in art-making practices once they've graduated. So Rifdi and we are honored to be the recipients for 2019, and our show is the 10th edition of this annual showcase.
So Fitri, how has your own explorations into the medium or the idea of self-identity brought you to your current project, A Plea?
So my exploration with identity actually started in 2018 with a project called Binti, Yaakob. Binti Yaakob delves into the notion of the breakdown of an idealistic concept of a healthy nuclear family and the consequences that comes from it, which is basically the intergenerational trauma and also the issues that stemmed from that baggage. So the series starts with 5 images of simulated nuclear family that comprised of 3 characters, the father, the mother, and the child. The 5 images, if displayed in a linear format, displays a type of narrative that visually depicts the eventual collapse of a family unit. So this images is actually very much representative of my own familial narrative. So just for context, my mother is Indonesian and she was part of an arranged marriage with a Singaporean man. So she moved over here to basically start her own family. But within a year or so, the marriage eventually broke down and fell apart. So my mother requested for a divorce and effectively left the marriage a few months before I was born. The divorce was settled before I was born, so I never had the chance to basically meet my biological father. I never knew who he was. I don't know what he looks like. So despite all of that, I still had an impression of him, even though it was very much unfavorable because my mother had brought back resentment and bitterness from the previous marriage, and somehow through that I formed a very biased perception of who he was or who he is basically. So almost naturally, her narrative started to bleed into mine, started to form into my own narrative, and I wasn't given the sort of tools to navigate through those kind of emotions, the painful emotions. I myself started to form my own set of issues. These issues are purely based on the discomfort and hatred over the fact that I was biologically related to a man whom have caused my mother a lot of pain. Basically, the fact that I can never run away from being his daughter brought so much uneasiness and unsettlement, and at almost every point of my life, I was reminded of that fact. So, for instance, even though my mom ran away from the marriage months before the divorce actually happened, the divorce settled on the very day that I was born. So every single time I had to celebrate my birthday, I still have to navigate through a set of confusing emotions because it is also the day that marks my mother's divorce with my own biological father, and that day is in itself very painful, but somehow it is also a day that marks my mom's freedom from a painful toxic relationship. If you were to look through the book, it has that sort of linear progression from the break of an ideal to the formation of a not so perfect family to finally the repercussions, which are basically the birth of several issues that I had to personally deal with. So of course it's littered with a lot of photos taken of me and also my mother. They're basically there to not only solidify the concept of a not so perfect nuclear family, and also to have that sort of juxtaposition with the studio shots that may be deemed rather explicit and somehow also quite clinical in terms of aesthetic.
So why did you put Binti Yaakob together in the same room as A Prayer Plea?
Right. So I personally believe that we will never be able to resolve our issues somehow, or rather, it's more of the fact that we learn to be comfortable, to be at peace with the issues that we deal with, but it will still remain at the back of our minds, basically. It's either that or it will somehow evolve into something else, something bigger. So the issues that I explored in Binti Yaakob, the issues that I had to deal with myself, they are fortunately something that I don't struggle with currently. However, the core issue still remains the fact that I am still biologically related to Yaakob. This reality will unfortunately stay with me now when I grow older, when I need to seek his blessings for marriage, and even after I die. So in Islam, there is this emphasis on familial ties, particularly with the father and child. So if we were to dive into the multiple stories of Prophet Muhammad, there was one that stated that he actually had a foster son by the name of Zaid. Because of the so-called familial ties that they actually form throughout his growing years, Prophet Muhammad basically gifted Zaid his name. So Zaid became Zaid bin Muhammad, right? But eventually there was a divine decree that stated that to do so is basically, number one, to lie, and number two, is basically delusion, because it is just mere sayings and it's not the fact, it's not the truth, right? Yeah, so basically from Zaid bin Muhammad, he had to revert back to Zaid bin Harithra. Similar to Zaid, I actually asked my religious teacher whether or not I could change my name, but he also said that it is not permissible. So I'm currently in a space whereby I cannot claim my current family as my own, because my stepfather isn't biologically related to me. And because in Islam, family name and family lineage is very much tied and associated with the paternal side of the family, I can't truly and confidently say that my half siblings, who are related to me by my mother, they may or may not be regarded as my nuclear family in the eyes of the religion, because we don't share the same father. So this issue of me being related to Yaakob has effectively given birth to a lot of complexities, and while I can somehow find a middle ground right now, I may or may not be able to find the same type of middle ground in the afterlife, right? So in Islam, we believe that when we enter the afterlife, we will go there with a very clean slate. What it means is we won't have any memories or experiences of this life, and basically we'll just go in there as a new Satian being in that sense. But we are However, given the opportunity to somehow meet our loved ones and also our family members, however, there is a point of contention because how they go about it is by placing the paternal head in the middle. And then afterwards, they will bring in the wives, and then they will bring in their children. So, because my paternal head is Yaakob, I won't be gravitated. I won't be pushed towards the direction where my stepfather is, basically. Yeah. So, and because my step siblings don't share the same surname as I do, they don't share the same father as I do. That may also mean that I may not be able to meet them in the afterlife as well. As for my mother, since she has effectively divorced Yaakob and remarried to my stepfather, so she is somehow considered as my stepfather's family instead of Yaakob's family. So again, I may or may not be able to meet her in the afterlife. So I am currently stuck in a situation where I may be forced to go to one direction, but the current me over here in this life wants the me in the afterlife to go towards a family that I've personally know of and personally form a sort of like relationship with, instead of, Yaakob, whom I've never met and I've...
The one you feel you belong to.
Yeah, the one that I belong to, yes. So the images that you will see, they are displayed as memories that I formed over here in this plane of existence. So these are the same memories that will be unfortunately erased once I die. So for some of the images, you will see black markings, which resulted from a bleach treatment on the 35mm strip. So these black marks, they represent the forceful removal of the memories that I have on this life. So just to conclude, in Islam, we believe that once we die, we will congregate to an open field called the Padang Mahsyar. So once we are there, we will somehow be introduced to, and they will somehow expose us to how we basically live our lives over here in dunya, right? So a prayer plea is basically a series of images that I would like to see once I reach Padang Mahsyar. So even though I do not have the physical or emotional memories over there, but I still would like to see a visual documentation of the people whom I love.
So Fitri, why is it so important for you to show such personal works to the public? Why is it important for you to share all these really intimate experiences with us?
Personally, I just think that my works are only important to me. In the sense that they give me an avenue to somehow navigate through my own emotions and my own thought process, right? So the issue behind a prayer plea actually started out 2 years ago. It made me realize, like the issue came to me 2 years ago during the fasting month, and I put it off for the longest time, and if it wasn't for this project, I wouldn't have confronted it, at least maybe not this early and not this fast. In the bigger scope of things, when it comes to showing it to the public, I would just like to have my artwork be appreciated for what it is, whether people use it as a soundboard for some form of reflection, or whether if they somehow find empathy or sympathy for whatever they see, that's great too. But I have never intended for it to be that way, right? So if people start questioning their own relationships with their own family, or maybe their own relationship with God in the spiritual sense, then I hope that somehow these works will help them confront or at least navigate through the entire discourse, as how much it has done for me lah. Yeah. So seeing as how this entire exhibition is about identity, and I know you've been exploring the concept far longer than I have, can you tell us how it actually started and what inspired you to go down this path, this rabbit hole?
So if I really had to pinpoint one moment in time where I really started to question how my identity is shaped by the world around me, it would be the 2017 presidential elections that we had, which was reserved only for Malay candidates. With that elections, I think the big question that was brought up was how we as a society wanted to define who would belong to each particular racial group and how we wanted to, in a sense, gatekeep who could fit into what box. For me, as someone of Malay and Chinese heritage, I think culture has always been something that I always held in high regard, but at the same time, I've always felt that it didn't comprehensively describe who I was, because I'm stuck in the middle. I don't really feel like I've belonged in either camp. So I've always felt constrained by the way we as a society view race as this thing that we can compartmentalize people neatly into almost like 4 different boxes: Chinese, Malay, Indian, others.
So what are some of the systematic boundaries that you've come to realize?
Well, the 2017 elections really exposed how we needed these boxes to be so neatly defined, especially when you consider that we're trying to elect someone who is we are trying to elect a president that is Malay. And so the question really came up of, what does it mean to be Malay enough? There was really so much talk about whether the initial candidates even qualified as being a Malay person in the eyes of the law, and to a greater extent, the eyes of Singapore society as a whole. So bringing back the topic to me, the question I really kept asking myself is how it affects me as someone who doesn't fit into all these prototypical boxes of how we see people. And for myself, actually, it's almost like I've grown up being defined by the antithesis of race. Basically, my Malay friends don't necessarily see me as being fully Malay, and my Chinese friends have never fully seen me as being Chinese. And even until today, a lot of my friends would, from time to time, tell me in my face, like, hey, sometimes I forget you're Malay. And like, what does it even mean? Like, why should my race in that particular instance matter? What does it change in terms of how I'm seen by them and how it changes the interaction between us? So those instances have always reminded me of how we are still always seen through the lens of race. And so how does our own society's perception of that race, like I said, in very easy to understand compartmentalized boxes, how does that then affect people like me who don't fit the system? So really, what cultural identity could I then be allowed to claim if I wasn't seen as one or the other? So I tried to address this in a photographic series I did in 2018 called Budaya, which is the Malay word for culture. I took photos of myself dressed in and undressing from my ethnic clothing, and I juxtaposed that by printing it onto Chinese silk, essentially trying to make my own interpretation of a Chinese scroll. So what I really enjoyed about doing that piece of work is that I liked how the dissonance between what you're seeing in the subject matter of this Malay figure imposed onto this interpretation of a Chinese scroll, how that was an analog of almost how people saw me as being very Chinese because I look very Chinese, but value-wise, in terms of culture, in terms of upbringing, I was brought up more in alignment with what I would consider more of my Malay heritage and Malay culture.
So I've seen that you've written quotes on the scroll in both English and Jawi. So for those of you who may not know, Jawi is actually the writing script that we've had before we adopted the English alphabet. So what is the quote and why Jawi?
So the quote is actually our constitution's definition of a Malay person, which was amended into our constitution just for the purposes of having all of these reserved elections. And it defines a Malay person as being a person belonging to the Malay community means any person, whether of the Malay race or otherwise, who considers himself to be a member of the Malay community and who is generally accepted as a member of the Malay community by that community. So there's almost like a duality here. It seems like it allows us to be able to declare for ourselves who we identify as and which culture we would like to call our own. But at the same time, the second part of it makes it seem like there is still a certain expectations. There's still a certain bar to meet, so-called, that the society as a whole would hold in terms of defining who you are and whether you belong there. So the reason why I wrote the Malay version of the quote in Jawi is to highlight how culture is something that's constantly changing and evolving. Jawi is now outmoded by the use of English letters, which is just another step in the multiple steps of changes that we've had over the years with regards to Malay culture itself. It was not so long ago that we were seen as different smaller groups who were living in the same archipelago before we decided that, yes, we were one people together. It wasn't so long ago that Malay was just a Creole language between different traders, and it wasn't a completely formed language until the Malaccan Sultanate came around and the language was used officially in state as well. So knowing that a culture is an organically evolving thing, is it then right for us to, have such clearly defined boxes? Do we really need such a clear image of who we are culturally?
So far, you've been talking about how your friends view you, right? So what about your family? How did they approach the subject?
Well, of course, them being my own family, extended family included, they are definitely more acute of the situation that I'm in. They're more aware of the situation that my parents are in as well. But when it comes to the way that I handle my own cultural heritage at home, there's almost this sense of guilt that I always feel, knowing that my family has a certain set of their own expectations of who I'm supposed to be as a person, of who I'm supposed to be religiously, and how all of these things inform me of my own Malayness. And so I always find myself wondering how I then fit into my own family's Malay Muslim heritage and story. So I realize that this feeling of guilt really stems from the invisible expectations that I feel that have been placed on me by my family. And I tried to explore these expectations through my final year project last year. The title of that was Jangka. So in Malay, Jangka actually has two meanings. One of them is expectations, and the other is a duration of time. So I quite liked how this duality in the meaning also gave the work two different levels of interpretation, because what I was really trying to explore again was those expectations that I feel like I'm not quite meeting, as well as how with the passage of time those expectations will only get stronger the more I feel like I am straying from the path. So the project Jangka culminated in a photo book where I presented images of objects in my own home that seemed to leave an impression of all those expectations onto myself. This all really started with this photograph that I took, which basically depicts my madrasa's uniform. Madrasa being the Muslim religious school, religious Sunday school, which was left hanging in the door of my bathroom behind like many layers of clothes that have built up over time on top of it. So essentially, what I was trying to show is that in 2011, I actually left my madrasa and I didn't tell my parents. I was afraid of the conversation coming up of like, why am I leaving? What am I dissatisfied with? And at that point in time, all I was really dissatisfied with was the way that Islam was being taught to me. And I felt that I didn't quite agree with and didn't quite fit into that whole system of education itself as well. So I was only found out months later, and even after that, the uniform itself was left hanging in my bathroom because I'm just a procrastinator, and I didn't really want to put it away because putting it away also it's a lot to unpack, and it also makes it seem like a very final thing that I'm really leaving, you know. And this guilt from straying from the path that they wanted me to be on, I realized was also a huge part of why I've constantly always been trying to search for a sense of belonging and a way to prove, in a sense, that I'm still Malay enough despite my own struggles with religion.
So it seems on a very personal level, you have always been struggling with this sense of dissatisfaction with how other people see you. So with the latest work, the mirror experiment, how is this the next step towards confronting that sort of dissatisfaction?
So coming off of completing Jangka last year, it was a really emotionally draining journey for me, and between that time and right now, I feel like I still haven't really been able to make any headway in terms of my own struggles with guilt and my ethnicity and what have you. So I didn't really want to make more projects if all I was saying was the same thing over and over again, if I wasn't saying something new. So I decided to take a step back and really look at how we understand identity as an independent construct rather than something that is informed by society around us. So during my research for Jangka, I actually did start looking into a lot of postmodern works on trying to define an identity. And one of the texts that really stood out to me was this novel called One, No One, and 100,000, written by Luigi Pirandello in the 1920s. So in that book, the main character, Moscada, he was staring at himself in the mirror one day, and his wife basically pointed out, hey, your nose droops down to one side. And it was something that he never noticed about himself before. So that kind of led him down this spiral of, hey, if my wife noticed something about my face that I've never noticed before, does that mean that she sees me in a different way? Does that mean that she has a completely different understanding of who I am as a person? And does that mean that then there's a version of Moscada, there's a version of himself that lives in his wife's mind that he is not privy to, that he can never see because that is something constructed in the mind of his wife? Does that then mean that every single person that Moscada has ever met has constructed a version of Moscada that he will never be able to know? So he really also questions then, who owns his identity? Is it himself, or is it every single person who owns a version of Moscada themselves? So that really intrigued me in the way that the ownership of an identity is also something I guess I've always had to struggle with. There's always been this gap that I always have to breach whenever I meet someone new, because the expectation when they first meet me is always, oh, this is a Chinese person because he looks so Chinese. And so I really have to then start define who I am most of the time it's through the struggle of language, because they would speak to me in Mandarin, and my mother tongue is Malay, so I have completely no understanding of the language. And most of the time when I say that I don't speak Mandarin, I'm then greeted by skepticism. They're like, are you sure you don't speak Mandarin? They would also ask, are you not Singaporean? Because then the next logical thing for them to think is, oh, maybe I am another East Asian, right? So I also distinctly remember in the first day of primary school, seated in class, and it was time to go for our first mother tongue lesson, and the Malay teacher came around and asked all the Malay students to step out. And when I stepped out, there was almost this like look of panic on his face, and he basically said, I think you misunderstood my instructions. And in secondary school, on the very first day of class, our form teacher was doing roll call, so he was reading out all our names. And when he came to my name, and when I raised up my hand, and I clearly remember him saying this, he said, "Oh, I thought you were Korean." There's clearly no Korean name on like that roster, so I don't know where he got that impression from. But these are all things that, it sounds funny, but in the moment itself, it's always so jarring to hear, and it's always, it is emotionally exhausting, but it's more, is this feeling of almost like dejection, more of like, I know I'm not who they think I am. So the reason why for this particular project I turned to looking at my own face is because growing up, I guess I've always had this sense of unfamiliarity with my own face. I've always felt that it was a face that didn't really represent who I was, who I identified as a person, and I felt that people misunderstanding who I am just because of the way I look was always a barrier that I had to overcome. So what I wanted to do with this project was to, in a sense, try to become more familiar with it, try to confront it, try to be able to accept it. So going into this project, I wanted to have the same entry point as Moscada in the story. So, which is why the very first two photographs that I actually took for this whole series is titled Experiment Number 2. And it's the two images that you see where I basically mirrored my own face, both halves of my face. So what I was trying to do was to have this very superficial study of all these small details of my own face that I've never noticed before. And similarly to Moscada, of course, he started to think about his own identity and the way he was seen through the realization that his own face is not something that's symmetrical. So I think with this technique that I was trying to do, what it really then highlights is all of these mirrored imperfections that start to become more visible. And I think we as people, when we look at ourselves in the mirror, we are already conditioned to ignore all of these small details. We just check whether our hair is in the right place today. Do we need to shave? Do we need to touch up our makeup? We don't really pay attention to all these small details because we would have already learned to gloss over them. So it was just a new way of me trying to see and realize all of these things like, oh, my moles line up in a very nice line, both horizontally on my forehead and vertically on my cheeks, and I never noticed that before. The other questions that was also brought up in the book was, with the advent of the technology of photography, it was the first time that people could see things recorded down in a very objective way without the brush of an artist to affect what they were seeing. So the question was then brought up, if you can see yourself in an image, isn't that then the truest form of yourself because it is objectively correct? Isn't that a true representation of you? And Moscada basically, he challenges that notion by saying that no, it is not the truest sense of yourself because, and I quote, "Excuse me, but seeing that you go to the photographer so often, when the photographer in front of you with his camera tells you to be sure not to move, you must have noticed life is suspended in you, and you feel that such suspension cannot last more than a second. It is like turning into a statue. for life is constant motion, and one can never really see oneself. So what I then wanted to do was to bring that same notion to today's context. In a world where we have access to video in our own pockets, through our own phones, what does that then do to inform us of our own identities? Can we see ourselves in a video, and can we see our truer self in that sense? And I think the same still applies in of what Moscada was saying in the book, which is that as long as you're aware of the presence of that camera, the camera itself affects the way that you present yourself to it. You are still, to some degree, performing for it, and therefore it is still something that you are showing rather than what the world sees of you on a daily basis. Which is why I then went on to do this other part, which is titled Experiment Number 25, which is basically 25 different videos, each an hour long, of me maintaining a smile for the whole duration of that hour. And why I wanted to do it that way was because it can't be that for the whole hour I can maintain that picture-perfect smile to the camera. I basically wanted to subvert or to undermine the presence of the camera by making it so long that my brain is forced to really go into more automatic reactions. My face starts to show more automatic smiles that people would see of me on a daily basis, and I would show them on a daily basis, rather than the smile that I keep picture perfect in front of the camera. So in a sense, what I was trying to do over that hour was, again, to remove the presence of the camera as much as I could from my own consciousness. Moving on from video, I also wanted to see what were the other new technological advancements that allowed us to see ourselves in new ways. And so I created experiment number 0010 by basically using this technique called photogrammetry, which is this technique where you take photographs of yourself from multiple angles, and the photogrammetry software itself would stitch all those photos together, and it would generate a three-dimensional model of your face. And with this three-dimensional model of the face, really what we can then see is the truest form of our face, the purest form of our faces, free of the texture of our face, the tonality of our face, removing or distracting us from the pure form of it. And really, the image then becomes almost like a topographical map of my own face. And besides the three-dimensional model, the software also generates this texture map, which is essentially almost like a stretched out version of my own face. And what it does with this texture map is it would project it onto the 3D model if I needed to see the three-dimensional model with the texture of my skin on it. So it is essentially my own attempt at trying out a new technology and using it for the purposes of self-portraiture. So what I did with the three-dimensional model was to then 3D print it, essentially making a bust of my own face. And I used it in experiment number 80, which is basically using a slide projector to project different frames of my own face onto the 3D printed bust of my own face. And I think experiment number 80 really encompasses all the ideas that I had for this whole series. We as people, the tangible aspect of ourselves is the physical body. But what gives this physical body meaning is that idea that we have identity, is the construct of identity itself. Yet, identity as a construct is something that is merely projected onto the physical nature of our own bodies. And that projection, again, can be affected by multiple things, can be affected by the way different people see us, can be affected by how society expects us to be. What I also kept in that slide projection is that I didn't purposefully make the projected image and the face line up all the time. I even kept frames from the roll that were incorrectly exposed, that had different artifacts in them, as a way of reminding the audience, I guess, that these projections are not something that will perfectly align with the physicality of the being themselves all the time. It is something that is constantly changing.
So with all of these experiments, I have two questions, right? So number one, what have you learned from it? And number two, is it uncomfortable, unsettling to see so many versions of yourself in one room? And with all of these versions, have you come to somehow find comfort or maybe familiarity with your own face right now?
See, the thing is, I've never actually really felt comfortable with my own face to begin with. So seeing so many blown up images of my face in a room isn't any more uncomfortable than the way I've always felt. Yeah, and I think at the end of all these experiments, you would expect that with me setting out to become more comfortable with my own face, that I would somehow find that. But actually, the opposite was true. The more that I actually stared at my own face, the more that it felt even more foreign, the more that I felt that it started to lose meaning. Have you ever been reading a passage in a book and you come across a word that you know is spelled correctly, and in that particular moment itself, there's somehow a disconnect between like the meaning of the word and the way it appears on the page? You know it's correct, but somehow there's this disconnect. And I think what the brain does sometimes is it starts to dissociate the physicality of an object or the signifier and what the object represents, which is the signified. And I think that's how I started to feel towards my own face, seeing it so many times over and over and over again, was that it started to become a physical thing that didn't necessarily have a meaning that I connotated to it. It started to lose its own meaning. And I tried to express that particular feeling that I had through the very last experiment that I did, which is experiment number 12. Which is basically, what I did was to take 500 different still frames from another hour-long video of me smiling. And what I started to do was to superimpose them together. So the very first image that you see is just one of those images, and by the time you get to the end, it's all 500 stacked on top of each other. It becomes this blurred smudge. So what I also realized was that taking all these 500 still frames, it's basically 500 different instances of myself. It was me through 500 different points in time. And also going back to the idea of like identity as a construct, as something that is supposed to be so well defined, is that really the case though? Because me yesterday versus me today versus me tomorrow versus me 1 year ago versus me 1 year from now can be completely different people. We can have completely different beliefs. We can think completely differently. But yet, those differences usually are very small. It's almost like it's a slight offset to who you were in a different particular point in time. And so all of these 500 different instances of myself stacked on top of each other, they're all slightly askew, slightly off-center. And I think when it creates that blurred image of an identity, when it creates that blurred construct, I think that's a more true representation of what identity really is. It's not this super sharp image of a clear idea of who you are. It's more like an approximation of the different ideas and the different emotions and thoughts that you will have that will constantly change over time as well.
So all of your topics have been very personal and they have been viewed in your own lens, right? So what would you like the audience to take away from your entire exhibition?
Like you said, at the end of the day, I'm just showing the world the way I see things, having had to navigate a very specific set of circumstances throughout my life. What I hope is that through my own experiences, my audience will be able to sympathize, if not empathize, with the work and hopefully be afforded new ways of seeing things. And I think at the end of the day, what all my work so far have shown is that we as individuals need to be able to think and situate ourselves within a social world that is constantly changing. The concept of culture itself is something that constantly changes. The concept of identity itself is something that constantly changes. So we cannot keep holding on to static views of things.
So through this show, A Self I Once Knew, the both of us offer two very different entry points towards assessing identity. So mine is very much informed by society and also family relations, while Rifdi is coming from a more introspective space, right? So we hope the show offers you new ways of appreciating and understanding a sense of personhood and self, and perhaps you too will be able to find or rediscover a self that you once knew.